When you imagine a prison cell, you think of isolation, concrete walls, and an environment that suffocates you. This is especially prevalent in America, where there has always been controversy in regards to the treatment of prisoners in more ways than one, affecting individuals' state of mind. Among those factors, architecture is an especially powerful tool in prison design, which also contributes to these prisoners' psyche. Del Upton, a professor of architectural history, discusses reforms in prison architecture during the 19th century in his book, Another City. In Chapter 10, Upton touches upon how the architecture in penitentiaries in Pennsylvania and New York State forced inmates to reform to society's ideal citizens. The penitentiaries were made to feel intimidating on the outside and to confine prisoners on the inside by incorporating dark, thick concrete walls and utilizing a grid-like structure to emphasize isolation. Upton emphasized that architecture heavily influenced the outcome of prisoner reform, most notably the failure of such attempts to construct and shape behavior. However, much of society focused mainly on the effect of penitentiaries' architecture and how it influenced the state of prisoners. In doing so, they disregarded other more complex considerations like geography, class, and race. Penitentiaries represent an idealistic attempt at rehabilitation, but also serve as a symbol and reminder of morally questionable practices that emphasize isolation and human reform. While architecture is one of the key components that led to the failure of idealistic reform, having set up the environment and the mindset to seek out reform in prisoners, other factors were still equally impactful. In the end, architecture did not exclusively determine the prisoner's states. Policy and practice ended up being more influential than the prisoner's architectural structure. Prison treatment was a major factor to the incarcerated individual's overall well-being. Due to popular public opinions about how crime could be treated like a disease, prisons isolated offenders, disciplined them, and placed them in carefully designed environments in order to cure them. Reformers believed this treatment would allow prisoners to return to society as better citizens. Prisons like the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia reflected this belief. Its radical plan, long corridors of identical cells, and the central surveillance hub embodied the ideas of order and confinement. Reformers argued this architecture would instill morality and discipline. Upton describes this as a paradox. Prisons were presented as humanitarian projects, yet they were intrinsically repressive. Reformers referred to penitentiaries as hospitals for the mind, but in practice they relied on forced isolation and corporal punishment. As historian Mary Gibson notes in Global Perspectives on the Birth of the Prison, punishment during this period shifted from public spectacle to hidden institutional control. At this time, punishment started turning into torture, subjecting inmates to harsher discipline. Beyond design and architecture, Upton brings attention to how class and hierarchy affected prison life. Reformers assumed that criminals were mostly lower-class white men, as Charles Dickens put it, degenerate citizens of the state. Prisons from this view enforced separation, division, and obedience, the same qualities reformers wished to see in society at large. These hierarchies and separations were not created by architecture. They were created and enforced daily by keepers and wardens. There are those who believe that architecture has a much bigger influence on rehabilitation that extend beyond Upton's argument. Following Grasso's article, he notes that disciplinary architecture was utilized in reform-oriented prisons. He also clarifies that there are other architectural influences, such as classrooms and workshops, for first-time offenders who are deemed more capable of rehabilitation. The use of architecture can be seen both as repressive and comforting, ultimately influencing one's mindset and direction as they go through rehabilitation. In regards to Upton's argument, repressive architecture was heavily evident during the construction and mindset behind penitentiaries, and the isolation they aimed for accurately gained great influence on prisoners. In some cases, control and hierarchy wasn't needed when prisoners were in constant solitude and isolation due to aspects like soundproof concrete walls and dark lighting that surrounded the cell. Since humans are social creatures, isolation itself could create drastic mental effects on the prisoners. This could only be successfully achieved through architecture, specifically orienting towards monotonous grid-like structures that emphasized enclosure. Through designs like that, it is true that architecture has a bigger impact than simply creating a depressing environment, and can actually affect prisoners' mental well-being by itself. Despite the reasoning that the environment can heavily impact the prisoner's states, the role of hierarchy and enforcement of a system is still more impactful. Upton mentions Gershom Powers, who says the prisons had convicts silently marching to and from their rest, meals, and labor at precise times, moving in separate corps in single file. Prison wardens enforce inmates by forcing strict rules and ways of living that restrict the prisoners. By setting a system of total compliance, it influences the idea of entrapment and control. Architecture can't do this by itself, though, as other people besides the designer put thought into creating the environment they enforce by always keeping a watchful eye and isolating prisoners. Del Upton and many others believe architecture in penitentiaries is what makes inmates reform and become perfect citizens. While architecture definitely has a role in how the prisoners change, it is not the sole reason for it, and it doesn't necessarily help them become better people. There are many other factors that went into play when seeing if inmates changed that had nothing to do with the architecture, like the roles of geography, class, and race, which all affected how the prisoners were treated separate to the design. All of these things have strong impacts on people and can make them act and behave differently, as well as have long-lasting effects and health issues based on their experiences.